scary story about the Craigslist curse, tales of terror and intrigue. Story 1: The Craigslist Killer's Haunted House of Horrors. Amy was a college student living in a small town, looking for a part-time job to help pay for her tuition. She saw an ad on Craigslist for a babysitting job and applied immediately. The pay was good, and it seemed like an easy job. So Amy was thrilled when she received an email back from the poster. The person who contacted her was a man named David. He lived in a large house on the outskirts of town and was looking for a babysitter for his 2 young children. Amy felt a little uneasy about the fact that the job was at his home, but David seemed polite and professional in his emails, so she agreed to meet him in person. When she arrived at the house, David greeted her at the door and showed her around the spacious living room. He introduced her to his 2 children, a boy and a girl, and told her that he would be leaving for a business trip and wouldn't be back until late that night. He gave her his cell phone number in case of an emergency and left her with a list of instructions. As soon as David left, Amy felt a strange unease come over her. The house was too quiet, too empty. She tried to distract herself by playing with the kids, but they seemed just as uneasy as she did. As the hours passed, Amy's phone started to buzz with texts from David, checking in to make sure everything was okay. It wasn't until she went to check on the kids that Amy realized something was wrong. She found them both sleeping in their beds, but their eyes were open, staring straight ahead. She tried to wake them up, but they wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she realized they weren't breathing. Amy frantically tried to call 911, but her phone wouldn't connect. She tried to leave the house, but the doors were locked. That's when she realized the true horror of her situation. David had never left the house. He had been watching her the entire time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Amy's screams echoed throughout the house as David emerged from the shadows, a sinister grin on his face. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was his hand reaching for her throat. The police found Amy's lifeless body in the house, along with the bodies of the 2 children. David was nowhere to be found, and the case remains unsolved to this day. It serves as a chilling reminder that not everything on Craigslist is what it seems. Days after the tragedy, the news of Amy's death spread like wildfire in the town. People were shocked and horrified, unable to comprehend how someone could be so cruel and heartless. The investigation revealed that David had used a fake identity on Craigslist to lure unsuspecting victims into his trap. He was a serial killer, with a long history of crimes that he had managed to keep hidden for years. As more and more details emerged about David's past, the townspeople became increasingly paranoid. They no longer trusted their neighbors or anyone they met online. The once friendly and close-knit community was now plagued with fear and suspicion. One night, months after Amy's death, a group of teenagers decided to play a prank on their friends. They created a fake Craigslist ad for a haunted house, promising a scary and thrilling experience. The ad quickly gained traction, and they began receiving responses from all over town. Excited about the success of their prank, the teenagers rented an abandoned house on the outskirts of town and started setting up the scares. They spent hours decorating the house with fake blood, skeletons, and other spooky props. As the night wore on, the first group of visitors arrived. The teenagers had set up hidden cameras to capture their reactions, and they eagerly watched from a separate room. The group of visitors were enjoying the scares, but as they moved deeper into the house, things began to take a dark turn. As the visitors explored the house, they began to notice that some of the props seemed disturbingly real. The fake blood on the walls was sticky and wet, and the skeletons seemed almost too lifelike. As they reached the end of the house, they stumbled upon a room that was completely dark. One of the visitors hesitated, sensing that something wasn't right, but the others urged him to go in, eager to see what awaited them. As soon as they entered the room, the door slammed shut behind them, and they were plunged into pitch darkness. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. Suddenly, the room began to fill with a thick fog, and they could hear whispers and moans all around them. The visitors started to scream and bang on the door, begging to be let out, but their cries went unanswered. Just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, they heard a low growling sound, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. The visitors huddled together, terrified, as they heard something clawing at the door, trying to get in. When the door finally opened, they were relieved to see that it was just the teenagers playing a prank. But as they stepped out of the room, they noticed that one of the visitors was missing. The teenagers searched the house, but they couldn't find the missing visitor anywhere. It wasn't until they reviewed the footage from their hidden cameras that they saw something that made their blood run cold. In the dark room, a shadowy figure had emerged from the fog, dragging the missing visitor away. The teenagers immediately called the police, but the investigation yielded no leads. The missing visitor was never found, and the teenagers were left to grapple with the guilt of their prank gone wrong. The incident shook the town to its core, and people became even more paranoid about Craigslist and the dangers of meeting strangers online. The abandoned house where the prank took place became a hotspot for ghost hunters and thrill seekers, but no one dared to enter the dark room where the shadowy figure had been seen. To this day, the townspeople still talk about the Craigslist killer and the haunted house prank gone wrong. And every Halloween, when the air is thick with the scent of autumn leaves and the sound of children's laughter, some say they can still hear the moans and whispers of the missing visitor, trapped forever in the haunted house. Story 2: The Mirror's Gateway, a Craigslist horror story. It was a hot summer day when Rachel decided to sell her old antique mirror on Craigslist. She had just moved into a new apartment and wanted to clear out some of her old belongings. Within hours of posting the ad, she received a message from a man named Jack, who was interested in buying the mirror. They exchanged a few messages, and Jack seemed friendly enough. He even offered to pay extra for the mirror, saying it would be the perfect addition to his antique collection. Rachel agreed to meet him later that day in a park near her apartment. When Rachel arrived at the park, Jack was already waiting for her. He was a tall, thin man with a strange smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine, but she dismissed it, thinking she was just being paranoid. Jack examined the mirror, nodding in approval. He handed Rachel an envelope filled with cash, and she handed him the mirror. As he turned to leave, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She watched him walk away, feeling a sense of unease that grew stronger with each passing second. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Jack's strange smile and the way he had looked at her. She decided to do some research on him, and what she found made her blood run cold. Jack was a known serial killer who had been using Craigslist to lure victims for years. He would buy items from unsuspecting sellers and use the opportunity to case their homes and plan his attacks. Rachel's heart raced as she realized she had just handed over her address and let a killer into her home. She immediately called the police, but it was too late. When they arrived at her apartment, they found it ransacked and empty. The antique mirror was gone, along with all of Rachel's other valuable possessions. For weeks, Rachel was plagued with nightmares of Jack breaking into her apartment and attacking her. She was terrified to leave her home, fearing that he would come back for her. And then one night, she heard a knock at her door. When she peered through the peephole, she saw Jack standing on the other side, grinning wickedly. Rachel screamed and ran to the back of her apartment, but she could hear him breaking down the door. As she hid in her closet, Rachel realized that there was only one way out. She grabbed a kitchen knife and waited, listening for the sound of Jack approaching. When he finally opened the closet door, Rachel lunged at him with the knife. Their struggle was short-lived. Rachel managed to stab Jack in the chest, but he overpowered her and pinned her to the ground. As she lay there, gasping for breath, she watched in horror as he pulled out the knife and plunged it into his own chest. The police arrived a few minutes later, but it was too late. Rachel was alive, but barely. She had narrowly escaped becoming another victim of the Craigslist killer. The antique mirror was never found, and Rachel couldn't bear to look at any of her remaining possessions without feeling a sense of terror. She moved away, hoping to leave the nightmare behind her, but every time she saw an ad on Craigslist, she couldn't help but wonder who might be lurking behind the screen, waiting to strike. Rachel's new apartment was a small, run-down studio on the outskirts of town. She thought that moving to a new place would help her forget about the horror she had experienced, but it seemed that the trauma was following her. Every night, she would have nightmares about Jack in the antique mirror, and every day, she would feel as though she was being watched. One night, Rachel woke up to a strange noise coming from outside her apartment. She got out of bed and cautiously approached the door. As she peered through the peephole, she saw a shadowy figure standing outside, looking directly at her. Rachel's heart began to race, and she quickly backed away from the door. For the next few days, Rachel lived in constant fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but she knew deep down that she was not alone. One evening, Rachel was sitting in her living room, watching TV, when she heard a knock at the door. She froze in fear, unsure of what to do. The knocking persisted, getting louder and more urgent. Rachel finally mustered up the courage to approach the door, but as she reached for the doorknob, it turned by itself, and the door swung open. Rachel stumbled backwards, horrified. The figure standing in the doorway was shrouded in darkness, with only the dim light from the street lamp outside illuminating its features. She couldn't make out any details, but she knew that this was the same figure she had seen outside her apartment earlier. The figure stepped inside and closed the door behind it. Rachel was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure slowly approached her, and as it drew closer, Rachel could feel a coldness radiating from it, as though it were not of this world. The figure stopped in front of Rachel and reached out a hand, which was icy to the touch. Rachel could feel her blood turning to ice as she realized that this was no ordinary person, but something much more sinister. The figure began to speak, its voice low and menacing. "I've been waiting for you, Rachel," it said, "waiting for you to let down your guard, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." Rachel tried to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The figure grabbed her by the arm and pulled her towards it. She could feel its breath on her face, and the smell of decay filled her nostrils. "You should have never sold that mirror," the figure said. "It was a gateway, a doorway to the other side, and now the other side has come for you." Rachel screamed as the figure's grip tightened, and she felt herself being dragged towards the bedroom. As they entered the room, Rachel saw that the antique mirror was hanging on the wall, its surface reflecting a dark, twisted version of the world. The figure pushed Rachel towards the mirror, and she fell against it. Feeling the cold surface against her skin, the figure stood behind her, its presence overwhelming, and Rachel knew that this was the end. Suddenly, the mirror began to shimmer, and Rachel felt herself being pulled into it. She screamed as she was sucked into a vortex of darkness, her body twisting and turning as she hurtled towards an unknown destination. When Rachel finally opened her eyes, she found herself in a dark, twisted version of her own apartment. The antique mirror was there, its surface flickering with an eerie light. Rachel tried to run, but she was trapped in this otherworldly realm, at the mercy of the figure that had brought her there. As Rachel huddled in a corner, trembling with fear, she realized that she had fallen victim to the dark forces that lurked on Craigslist. The antique mirror had been a portal, a gateway to a world beyond our own, and she had foolishly sold it to a man who knew its true power. Now, Rachel was trapped in a realm of terror, with no hope of escape. She knew that she had made a fatal mistake, and that she would pay for it with her life.